Have you ever woken up in the middle of nowhere, completely isolated, only to realize you weren't alone? This story will make you think twice before venturing into the wilderness. What started as a fun winter camping trip for 3 friends turned into a nightmare they'll never forget. And by the end of this tale, you might start questioning every shadow you see in the woods. It all started on a cold Friday evening. Liam, Mark, and Jenna had planned this camping trip for months. They wanted to experience the beauty of untouched, snow-covered landscapes. They found a remote spot, deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization, the perfect place to unwind and disconnect. The drive was long and winding, the snowflakes thickening as they ventured further. By the time they reached their destination, the sun was already setting. The trio quickly set up their tents near a frozen lake, surrounded by towering pines. Jenna remarked how quiet it was. Too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the deafening silence of winter. Panic set in as the daylight faded. They were stranded, with no signal and no way out until help arrived. They decided to ration their food and wait it out. That night was worse. Much worse. The noises started again. This time it wasn't just footsteps, it was whispers. Soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The friends huddled together in one tent, too scared to investigate. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the campsite, followed by the sound of something being dragged. Liam unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The campfire they had left burning low was now extinguished. Their gear had been scattered, and the snow was marked with long, deep grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Then, they saw it. Standing in the shadows of the trees was the figure Jenna had seen. Its form was clearer now, a tall, emaciated silhouette with unnaturally long arms that hung almost to the ground. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but 2 glowing eyes pierced the darkness. "Run!" Liam screamed. The 3 bolted from the tent, their breaths visible in the icy air. They ran blindly into the woods, the whispers growing louder, more frenzied. Mark tripped and fell, screaming as he looked back. The figure was following them, moving unnaturally fast, its limbs jerking with each step. They finally reached the frozen lake. Desperate, they ran onto the ice, hoping the figure wouldn't follow. Hunger so haunted him. He was terrified. They ran onto the ice, hoping the figure wouldn't follow, but it did. As they reached the center of the lake, a deafening crack echoed beneath their feet. The ice was breaking. Jenna screamed as she felt the ground shift. The figure stopped at the edge of the lake, tilting its head again. Then, with an ear-splitting screech, it vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness. The friends were rescued the next morning by a search party. They never spoke of what happened that night, but none of them ever ventured into the woods again. Locals later claimed that the lake was cursed, tied to the spirits of those lost in the forest. Jenna, Liam, and Mark still dream of the figure, its glowing eyes watching them from the shadows. Standing at the edge of their campsite was a figure, tall and motionless. It was draped in what looked like tattered, dark fabric. Jenna held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if aware she was watching. She ducked back inside, shaking Liam awake. "There's someone out there," she whispered, her voice trembling. Liam grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, but the figure was gone, leaving only a single set of deep footprints leading into the woods. "Could be a hiker," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Mark dismissed it as paranoia. "These woods mess with your head. Let's all get some sleep." But no one slept that night. The next morning they found something chilling. Around their tents were dozens of footprints, circling and overlapping, as if someone had been pacing all night. The group decided to pack up and leave, but when they tried to start the car, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. That first night, as they sat around the campfire, Liam shared an old local legend. "They say these woods are haunted," he began, grinning. "Decades ago, a group of loggers went missing here. When a search party found their campsite, all they saw were scattered tools and footprints leading nowhere. Some say the forest takes people." Mark rolled his eyes. Classic campfire story. But Jenna couldn't shake the unease. "Let's just not tempt fate, okay?" The next day was uneventful, filled with snowshoeing and taking photos. But as dusk approached, they noticed something odd. Their footprints from earlier were completely gone, not covered by snow, just gone, as if they had never walked there. Liam laughed it off, blaming the wind, but Jenna insisted it was strange. That night, the unease grew. Around midnight, Jenna woke up to a soft sound, like crunching snow. At first, she thought it was Mark or Liam, but when she peered out of the tent, her blood ran cold. This story is about 3 friends whose winter camping trip turned into a nightmare they'll never escape. The snow wasn't the only thing waiting for them in the woods. Stick around, because this one will leave you sleeping with the lights on. It was mid-December when Mia, Heron, and Jake decided to go on their long-planned winter camping trip. The idea was to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. They chose a spot deep in the Rockies, known for its breathtaking views and isolated tranquility. The drive up was uneventful, the roads winding and snow-covered. They joked and laughed, oblivious to the storm warnings on the radio. By the time they reached the trailhead, the sun was dipping behind the mountains. They trekked for miles, their gear heavy, until they found a small clearing surrounded by dense evergreens. They heard a voice cry out, and then roans heard Grail cry. They pitched their tents near a frozen stream, the silence of the forest almost deafening. That night, as they sat around the campfire, Aaron told a story he'd heard about the area, how hikers had gone missing, leaving behind only their empty campsites. "Some say it's the wind," he said, grinning. "Others say it's something else." Jake laughed it off. Mia rolled her eyes but couldn't shake a growing unease. The next day the trio explored the area, taking photos and marveling at the untouched snow. But as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. First, Mia noticed their footprints from earlier were gone, as if the snow had erased them. Then, Jake swore he heard faint laughter coming from the trees. Aaron brushed it off, saying it was just the wind. That evening, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. As they huddled in their tents, Mia heard it, a low guttural whisper right outside. She froze, her heart pounding. It was saying her name. She shook Aaron awake. He listened, his face pale. They unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was out, and there at the edge of the clearing was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like tattered rags. It stood motionless, its head cocked as if listening. Aaron whispered, "Jake, wake up." But Jake wasn't in his tent. Panic set in. They called out for Jake, their voices trembling. The figure didn't move, but seemed to grow darker, its presence swallowing the dim light from their flashlights. Then a scream echoed through the forest. Jake's voice filled with terror. They ran toward the sound, their boots crunching through the snow. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. Suddenly, they found Jake. He was standing in a small clearing, staring at something they couldn't see. His face was blank, his eyes wide with fear. When they grabbed him, he didn't resist. He just whispered, "It's watching us." They dragged him back to the campsite, but the figure was gone. The forest was eerily silent. That night, the storm hit. Snow piled up around their tents and the temperature plummeted. They decided to leave at first light, but when dawn came, their path was gone. The snow had buried everything, and the forest seemed unfamiliar, like it had changed overnight. They wandered for hours, the whispers following them. Jake's condition worsened. He kept muttering about it coming closer, just as they thought they were lost for good. They stumbled onto a road and flagged down a passing ranger. When they looked back, the figure was there, standing at the tree line watching. None of them ever went camping again. Jake moved away and cut off contact. Mia and Aaron still have nightmares about that trip, and to this day they can't explain what they saw. Alex, Dana, and Chris were best friends who loved adventure. They had camped in every season, but this was their first winter camping trip. Dana had found a remote spot online, a frozen valley surrounded by rugged cliffs and thick forest. No cell service, no roads for miles, a perfect winter retreat. They arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The temperature plummeted, and the valley was eerily silent. They pitched their tents in a clearing, the snow crunching loudly underfoot. Chris joked about how quiet it was. "Too quiet for my taste," he said, grinning nervously. As they lit a fire and huddled around it, Alex noticed something strange. Near the edge of the clearing, the snow was disturbed, forming odd shapes. Curious, they approached. The shapes were patterns, symbols carved into the snow, spiraling and intricate. Dana frowned. "Maybe it's just kids messing around." Chris shook his head. "There are no footprints leading to these symbols. How could anyone have made them?" Unnerved but unwilling to ruin the trip, they returned to the fire. "Let's just forget about it," Alex suggested, though none of them could shake the uneasy feeling that lingered. The next day they explored the valley. The snow was pristine and the cliffs were breathtaking, but something felt wrong. Every now and then Dana stopped, swearing she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Alex laughed it off, but Chris admitted he felt it too, like they were being watched. By evening they found more symbols carved into the snow. This time they were closer to their campsite. The patterns were larger and more elaborate, and now they seemed to form a trail leading toward the forest. Dana insisted they follow it, but Alex protested. "Are you crazy? This is the setup for every horror story ever. Then we stay here and wait for whoever or whatever did this to come to us," Dana snapped back. Reluctantly, they followed the symbols into the woods. As the sun set, the forest grew darker, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows. The voice went on. The trail ended at a tree with deep claw marks gouged into the bark. Below it lay a crude wooden figurine, half buried in the snow. It was humanoid but twisted, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Chris picked it up, frowning. "What the hell is this?" Suddenly, a loud cracking sound echoed through the forest, followed by what sounded like whispering. It was faint, but unmistakable. They sprinted back to camp, but when they arrived, they found the fire extinguished and their tents slashed open. The symbols were now carved into the snow around their campsite, forming a perfect circle. "We're leaving now," Alex said, his voice shaking, but as they approached their car, they froze. Standing in the middle of the trail was a figure, tall and unnaturally thin, wrapped in what looked like strips of cloth. Its face was obscured, but its head tilted, as if studying them. "Don't move," Dana whispered. The figure raised an arm, its hand clawed and bony, and pointed at them. The whispering grew louder, coming from every direction. Panic overtook them, and they bolted. The figure didn't follow, but the whispers stayed with them, growing more frantic the further they ran. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the valley. By then the whispers had faded, but the feeling of being watched never left. They drove home in silence, too terrified to speak of what had happened. Weeks later, Dana woke up to find a single wooden figurine on their windowsill, identical to the one they'd found in the forest. Alex, Chris, and Dana all moved far from their hometown, but they still dream of the symbols, the whispers, and the figure in the woods.